Forgive me if my eyes move around a bit. It's that balance between looking in the camera directly at all of you and reading the paper that I've got in front of me, the notes I've got in front of me. So if I look a bit weird, I apologise for that. This paper is entitled Vulnerability and Entanglement Towards a New Ontology of Human Rights for the Anthropocene. And in it, I want to sketch out in the broadest sense a proposal for a new human rights ontology. The ontology I want to offer will undergird a distinction I want to play with, which is the distinction between what I'm calling human rights of the Anthropocene and human rights for the Anthropocene. By human rights of the Anthropocene, human rights that stand in line with the ontological assumptions beneath the life-colonising dynamics connected to the Anthropocene itself. A human rights for the Anthropocene, in contrast, is a human rights reimagined, standing on a different ontology, one capable of grounding the breadths and depths of an empathic reimagination of who's here that I think is fundamental to urgently needed kinds of justice-making practices for the Anthropocene. Now, this is necessarily a very brief sketch. It unfolds in three main phases. First, I want to do a quick pre-calibration by framing the Anthropocene in human rights for the purposes of my reflection. And then I want to introduce the importance of ontology to questions of human rights injustices and for practices of human rights justice making. And finally, I'll sketch out the ontological direction, just in broad terms, for reimagining human rights for the Anthropocene. I'll start with the Anthropocene itself. The common understanding of the Anthropocene, as is well known, is the idea that human activities have led to Earth system tipping points signalled by decisive markers in the geology of the planet. These markers, some say, are sufficiently significant to warrant the declaration of a new geological era, the new age of Anthropos, the human age. I want to mention just two critiques of the Anthropocene framing, and I choose these two because they're highly relevant for the framing I want to place around the question of human rights for the Anthropocene. The first critique is that the Anthropos of the Anthropocene is not, despite its name, a species figuration at all. The thinking is broadly this. It's entirely clear from a wide range of scholarship that not all humans are responsible for the conditions leading to the Anthropocene. Perhaps Malm and Hornborg say it best when they point out that the processes of capitalist industrialisation most commonly associated with the Anthropocene were highly uneven from the very outset and entirely interwoven with European colonialism. In fact, even the leading geological contender for the start of the Anthropocene, chosen by Lewis and Maslin, the Orbis spike of 1610, is a signal of Eurocentric capitalism's fateful impacts. The Orbis spike, in reality, marked the collision between Europeans and the indigenous populations of the New World, which resulted in over 50 million deaths and a resultant drop in global CO2 markers. As European coloniality intensified over time, so capitalism deepened its grip on the world system, organising the international legal order to serve the systematic priority of the global north over the global south. And this particular line of critique has led many to prefer the terminology of the Capitalocene. The multiple and overlapping crises now faced by populations all over the planet are predominantly caused not by Anthropos as the human species, but by Anthropos as the Eurocentric capitalistic trope at the heart of human hierarchies of being that persist even to this very day. The second critique I want to fold into today's reflection turns on the fact that Anthropos is assumed to have hubristic levels of earth-forging power. The discourse of the Anthropocene often overlooks the lively contributions of the planet itself to the present dangerous configuration of forces facing all life on Earth. Connolly has argued, rightly I think, that it is essential to bring into the frame all the bumpy temporalities and self-organising forces of the planetary and to read them in conjunction with the impacts of colonial capitalism if we are truly to understand the dangers triggered by the convergence and to find adequate political responses to the trouble we are all in. What then of human rights? A critical reading of the assumed human of human rights has much in common with the assumed anthropos of the Anthropocene, and much of this commonality resides precisely in the ontological underpinnings at work. Just like Anthropos, the human rights universal is a supposedly universal representative of the human, and much like the Anthropos, the human rights universal is nowhere near as inclusive as its surface presentation implies. Human rights, as is well known, have long been haunted by important critical questions concerning the human that makes up their species category. They have been, for example, criticised for their Eurocentrism, called out for their role in legitimating an unjust international order, called out as trade-related market-friendly constructs colonised by global corporate power, called out as key components of a new global constitutionalism for neoliberal capital, and so on and so forth. And key to these critiques, and to the convergences between Anthropos and the universal of human rights, is the persistence of a particular pattern of human privilege. Not a simple anthropocentrism at all, but the kind of civilizational privilege accorded to the idealised trope of the rational European man as signalled by the Cartesian and then Kantian dignified agent whose disembodied rationality is only really attributable to European males. It's unsurprising that human rights' long history is marked by a struggle to include the others to its non-universal. It's unsurprising that there has been the need for a kaleidoscopic list of treaties based on other subjectivities, women, children, migrant workers, indigenous peoples, and so on. And lurking under all these patterns is an ontology. So now I turn to this second main stage of my reflection. Why does ontology matter? Why am I focusing there? It matters because ontology is never neutral and it is pivotal. The ontology of human rights in the Kantian, neo-Kantian mode assumes a set of subject-object relations based on the fundamentally dualistic split between mind and matter proposed by Descartes, but echoing dualisms much older than his, of course. The human agent stands in the foundations of law generally and of the law and traditional discourse of human rights as an ultimately Eurocentric complex of rationality, agency, will, and self-ownership. The rights-bearing subject, whether understood as the individual dignified rights-bearing subject, the corporate subject, or the nation-state, is marked by the ontology of Eurocentric rationality and civilizational priority. All the rest, all its others, in other words, non-dominant humans, non-human animals, ecosystems, and so on, all these others in various complex degrees are marginalised or excluded from full legal and political subjectivity and from ultimate significance. Connolly's work and other work at the very cutting edge of science and philosophy now reveals that these ontological assumptions just can no longer hold. They are simply implausible. The dropping away of their ontological assumptions makes human rights, to say the least, rather complicated as tools of justice for the Anthropocene. Human rights in some respects are too much the human rights of the Anthropocene because they have been for too long mediated by the complex priority of the anthropos and its implausible, hierarchical ontological grounds. But human rights are also a restless principle of hope. They are also a restless politics of the possible. They also instantiate, particularly in the hands of communities in struggle all over the planet, a powerful reaching beyond the closures of human rights themselves, a chafing against the patterns of institutionalised privilege, a yearning for, can we say it? Can we be bold enough to say it? A planetary justice yet to come. If human rights are to be human rights for, rather than of, the Anthropocene, they need a new ontological foundation. They simply cannot rest on the same problematic ontology that brought us the Anthropocene in the first place. So here's my most urgent argument. We need a new juridical ontology. In simpler language, we have entirely to displace the existing subject-object relations if transformation is to have a chance. Connolly's important call for attention to the lively agencies of the planet itself in the production of the Anthropocene points us, I would argue, in the right ontological direction. So let's follow the trail briefly. The best renewing ontological direction is a turn towards the lively, self-organising agency of materiality itself. This, in any case, is the only rational move. New scientific advances and technological developments are now making this new attention to materiality absolutely mandatory, and the findings emerging present a profound challenge to some of the most basic assumptions that have underpinned the modern world, including its normative sense of the human and its beliefs about human agency and its material practices, such as the ways we labour on, exploit and interact with nature. Science is showing us, in short, that classic subject-object relations and all the institutional and legal structures that assume them are simply out of touch with what is really there and what is really happening. This includes human rights. If science is undermining the fundamental assumptions, shoring up human exceptionalism and methodological individualism, then the entire traditional legal, political and philosophical grounding of human rights loses the certainty of its once taken for granted. About time too, because human rights face distinctively 21st century complexities now. The Anthropocene crises, climate change, human and non-human population movements, biotechnologies, instantaneous algorithm-driven global capital flows, rapidly evolving artificial and robotic intelligences, the saturation of contemporary life in digitalisation and virtual technologies and on. It's impossible, in the light of all this, responsibly to cling to the once comforting idea that agents are exclusively humans who possess cognitive abilities, intentionality and freedom to make autonomous decisions, and the corollary presumption that humans have the right or ability to master nature. Humans are not the unrealistically constructed rational agents of Eurocentrism. Humans are in reality just one particularly destructive partner in an entangled world full of lively, pressing agencies and forces, a world in which once we see it, we realise that even the Anthropocene is co-produced by planetary forces and flows, acting as self-organising systems that intensify the fallouts of industrialisation and rapacious capitalism. So in the face of this loss of the ontological centre, what might human rights become? What might human rights for the Anthropocene become? First, they become an order of rights responsive to materiality for which the human is relocated, now immersed in a larger, far more active field in which matter has its own lively agencies, its own modes of self-transformation, self-organisation and directedness. This, for starters, demands a whole new level of epistemic and ontological humility. Secondly, and as a result, the stable pre-existent subject-object split presupposed by human rights is revealed for the illusion it always was. Human rights thinking needs to plunge into a world marked by entanglements and by vulnerabilities, where shifting flows and lively forces co-world a vulnerable entanglement of bodies, macro bodies, micro bodies, human and non-human bodies, all caught up together and apart in the planetary toxicities and pressures of the Anthropocene predicament. For human rights reasoning and processes, this might mean that new forms of knowing must become key to human rights justice making. Courts, constituencies and movements of all kinds in the human rights field will need to embrace new kinds of openness to patterns, insights, voices, traces and stories from multiple constituencies of meaning making. This will include, of course, Indigenous peoples. It will also include non-human partners. It will mean resisting the lure of the now unsustainable master story of the hubristic human dominating the world with its fantasy of its own unmatched ethical significance. Human rights must reject what Barad calls the assumption of natural, pure and innocent separations, but do so without reaching for a total dissolution of boundaries. We need boundaries, but we might trace them from a different starting point, with different expectations, contingent, never confident of fixity, always alert to the complex production of new forms of material injustice. Human rights would become, in short, even more attentive and complex. They would become the rights of humans as a certain kind of critter, to evoke Haraway. This human critter is more realistically positioned in relation to the factity, the empirical actuality of human ontological co-constitution with multiple collaborators, macroscopic, such as planetary flows and forces, and microscopic, including the microbiotic and cellular entanglements making up the human itself. This shift would mean that humans and non-humans would be co-situated in new ethical, juridical and scientific knots of significance, and in relation to that, human rights for the Anthropocene will necessarily attend to the problem of radical unevenness, to the radical unevenness of anthropos and its assumed privileges, and to the radical unevenness of material exposure to the Anthropocene itself. Human rights for the Anthropocene would be a site for the generation of new, more all-embracing kinds of responsibility. Human rights of the Anthropocene were the entitlements of abstractly dignified exceptionalist human subjects. Human rights for the Anthropocene would be human rights as a mode of particular attentiveness towards the rights of humans in a more than human world. Nothing less than facing up to all of this will be sufficient for human rights for the Anthropocene. Nothing less than reimagining the human and human rights alike will now do. And this means paying attention not only to the patterns of coloniality and injustice enfolded into the Anthropocene, but also to the planetary agencies and lively materialities at work in the world. Human rights for the Anthropocene should be constructed, I think, as a new kind of ontopolitics of the possible, a new kind of critical energy for sustained engagement with the sheer depth, the sheer complexity of the trouble we're all in. Now, while all the practical implications need working out over time, one thing is now certain. Without a transforming ontology, there will be no transformation deep enough. Thank you for listening.